With infrastructure now a topic of daily discussion, how do you plan to prepare the state of Maryland to become a top competitor for bridges, high-speed broadband, etc.?
Well, hopefully we've got some exciting opportunities on the horizon with a federal-state partnership around infrastructure. So first and foremost, what I'm most excited about is the opportunity to tackle climate action. That most recent report made clear that climate change is a huge threat to our well-being on this earth as human beings. And we also know in Maryland, we are already seeing the consequences of climate change. We are already losing farmland to saltwater intrusion. We have parts of the state, like Howard County, where we have flooding regularly. So the opportunity with infrastructure dollars to move to renewable energy, to start to move our cars to electric, to start to invest in public transit, to invest in solar and wind and geothermal. Those are huge opportunities for the state. And the other piece I'm excited about with infrastructure is quality of life improvements. Folks in Maryland hate sitting in traffic. We can tackle that if we invest in public transit and if we invest in reliable internet access, broadband. We can make it easier for people to work from home, to have more flexible schedules that will help us reduce traffic. So lots of good opportunities. We got to make sure Congress delivers for the country.
As a result of the pandemic, many small businesses were forced to close their doors. What is your plan for an economic recovery?
The good news is between the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure proposal, and President Biden's American Families Plan, that's really going to help us to jumpstart economic recovery in the state. But then we've got to, as a state, have a plan to leverage our assets. We've got University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins, National Institutes of Health. We are right here in the DC metro region where there are thousands of open jobs in cybersecurity. So in Maryland, we should be thinking about how do we leverage those research institutions, those federal job opportunities to create more good jobs for Marylanders. We have to make sure our folks are prepared for those good jobs. That means we have to invest in our education system, K through 12, our community colleges, our historically Black colleges and universities, and of course our regional public universities. So that's the foundation for the long-term success of our economy.
The crisis in Afghanistan has only worsened. Do you see the state of Maryland potentially being a new home for all those being displaced by the Taliban takeover?
I hope we will welcome folks from Afghanistan into Maryland, certainly folks who've been translators, who've worked with the United States to try to produce a more stable, more healthy country in Afghanistan. I know that they're frustrated, they're going through tremendous pain as they see the Taliban take over. So we've got to make sure that they're able to come to Maryland, adjust to life in Maryland, enroll their kids in Maryland schools. And this is a bipartisan priority. We've had our leaders in the state across parties commit to welcoming folks from Afghanistan. Now we've got to follow through and make sure that we support their successful transition to Maryland.
You say the state needs an educator in office. What experience do you bring to the table as an educator?
Well, I started out as a high school social studies teacher, and then I was a middle school principal, and then I worked at the local level, at the state level, had the opportunity to serve as Secretary of Education for President Obama. In that role, I was responsible for the 50 million students who are in our K-12 schools, responsible for a budget that was nearly $70 billion, about $15 billion bigger than the budget of the state of Maryland. And then since the end of the administration, I've been running an education civil rights organization called the Education Trust, working to expand opportunity, particularly for low-income students and students of color. So I bring a track record of working on equity issues, experience with executive management, managing large teams, managing large budgets, getting big things done in government. And the last piece, and you know this from your experience with teachers, good teachers are good listeners, are folks who see their students and their students' families as whole people, who try to understand what challenges they're facing and try to help them overcome those challenges. That's the approach I'd bring to being governor.
Calls for police reform continue following the death of George Floyd in 2020 at the hands of law enforcement. If elected, do you have any plans for police reform?
Good news, in Maryland, we passed a very ambitious police reform package during the last General Assembly session. And so In Maryland, legislators were moved by the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor. And they were moved to introduce real accountability for officers who violate the civil rights of folks in our communities. That said, we need to build on that work by trying to reimagine public safety, by investing more resources in mental health services, addiction treatment, so that police officers are able to focus on investigating violent crimes, investigating murder, and aren't called to deal with a mental health crisis that actually would be better addressed by a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker. So one of our projects in Maryland when I'm governor will be to make sure that we deploy the police to crime fighting, particularly violent crime fighting, and that we couple that with investments in the kinds of resources that will help people in crisis. Mental health services, addiction treatment, violence prevention programs. There's a cycle of violence that happens in communities where people retaliate through violence. But we know that there are programs that can break that cycle of violence. Someone comes to the hospital and says, to a young person, here's why you shouldn't go out and retaliate against the people who harmed your friend or your loved one. And here's a different way to think about how we move forward as a community. Those investments are proven to work. We need to make more of those in Maryland.
What other policy changes do you see the need for in state government?
Well, look, at a macro level, I think three things I would focus on. One, we've really got to invest in education. We've got to make sure that every child, regardless of race, regardless of zip code, regardless of immigration status, can get an excellent K-12 education. And we've got to invest in the foundation for that K-12 education, childcare and early childhood education. Every family should know that they can get affordable, quality, early childhood education, birth through 5 in Maryland. So that's one. Two, we've got to grow our economy in the state. We've got to grow good jobs. We've really got to attend to issues of economic dignity. Are folks able to take paid family leave when they have a new child in their family or someone sick in their family? Can they take care of them without fearing that they're going to lose their job? Can people find affordable housing? Do they have access to good public transit? Those kinds of quality of life issues are also a part of our economic development strategy and our economic development goals. And then third, as I mentioned, we've got to take climate action, we've got to address environmental justice. I want Maryland to be one of the first states to be zero greenhouse gas emissions. We can get there, and we can build renewable energy as part of that economic development strategy.
John King, Democratic candidate for governor in the state of Maryland. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Jaden. Really appreciate your thoughtful questions.